Today, we're diving deep into a really serious charge against one of the giants of Eastern literature, Muhammad Iqbal. You've probably seen it online, these viral posts claiming he was a plagiarist. But is there any fire to go with all that smoke? Well, we're going to cut through the social media noise and look at what the actual evidence, the text itself, has to say. So that's the big question, right? Was Iqbal this brilliant original poet who masterfully blended ideas from the East and the West? Or was he a fraud who built his entire legacy on stolen work? And look, this is a huge deal. It's a serious accusation against a figure who's not just a national poet, but a spiritual icon for millions. That's exactly why we have to do this right, with a thorough, evidence-based investigation. Yeah, this thing just blew up online. You see these posts with poems side by side, and they're often presented like it's this open and shut case, a real smoking gun. But our goal here is to go way beyond just screenshots. Anybody can share a screenshot. We need to dig into the original publications, understand the historical context, and look at the academic record to see what the evidence actually tells us. All right, so to get to the bottom of this, here's our game plan. We've structured this whole investigation into 6 parts. First, we'll set the standards for how we judge this. Then, we're going to open 3 different case files on the main allegations. After we've gone through the evidence in each of those, we'll step back, look at the hard numbers, and then, finally, we'll reach our final assessment. Let's get started. Okay, first things first, we have to set some ground rules. To be fair about this, we can't just apply today's standards to someone writing 100 years ago. So we're going to evaluate these claims through 2 different lenses. First, the accepted literary norms of his time, the early 20th century. And second, the much stricter academic standards we have today. Judging him by both is really the only way we can get to a fair and balanced conclusion. Let's open our first case file. This one's all about his poems for children. And we're going to start with the most famous example you see online, that school prayer known all across South Asia, Labbe Ati Hai Dua. This is usually presented as Exhibit A in the case against him. Okay, so take a look at this. On the left, you've got A Child's Hymn by an English poet, Matilda Betham Edwards. On the right, Iqbal's famous prayer. And yeah, the thematic link is undeniable. Both use that metaphor of light as a force for good. And you can see why this looks bad, right? On the surface, it seems pretty damning. But, and this is a huge but, here is the key piece of evidence. This is taken straight from the very first edition of his poetry collection, Bangedara, which came out in 1924. Right there, above the poem, you see this word, Makhuz. In Urdu, that means borrowed from or inspired by. He wasn't trying to hide the source. He was literally signaling to his readers that this was an adaptation. This one word changes the entire context. It turns what looks like plagiarism into an acknowledged translation. And this wasn't just a one-off thing. It was actually part of a very clear pattern. Of the 7 English children's poems he adopted, he explicitly acknowledged 6 of them. He was openly taking part in what was a pretty common literary practice back then, introducing popular Western works to a new Urdu-speaking audience. So, fair question. What about that 7th poem? Well, there is one genuine issue with attribution. The Bird's Lament, which he adapted from a poem by William Cowper, appears without that Makhuz label. But here's the thing. Scholars point out that in that very same collection, Iqbal actually made the opposite mistake. He mistakenly attributed one of his own original poems to Cowper. Now, that strongly suggests that this was all just an editorial error in a really complex manuscript, not some deliberate plan to deceive anyone. Okay, on to our next case file. We're moving from poetry to philosophy now. The big accusation here is that Iqbal's core concept, his idea of Khudi, or selfhood, was just lifted directly from the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. And this really forces us to ask a tough question. Where do you draw the line between being influenced by someone and just straight up imitating them? To really get this, we first have to know what these 2 ideas even mean. For Iqbal, Khudi is all about strengthening the self so you can better understand and submit to a divine universal will. It's totally rooted in Islamic theology. Nietzsche's Übermensch, or Superman, is, well, it's pretty much the exact opposite. It's about the individual will smashing free from all traditional morals, especially religious ones, to become its own source of truth and value. When you actually put them side by side like this, the differences are, well, they're massive. Iqbal's ideal person is God-centric. Nietzsche's is radically human-centric. The goal for one is submission to God. For the other, it's the assertion of your own will over everything else. Iqbal openly said he was influenced by Western thinkers, but he wasn't just copying and pasting. He was synthesizing, taking bits and pieces he found interesting and then completely transforming them, fitting them into an Islamic worldview that was fundamentally at odds with Nietzsche's entire project. And now for our third and final case file. This one looks at Iqbal's most profound and probably most complex literary relationship, his deep connection to the 13th century mystic, Rumi. Critics will point to the incredible similarities in their work and say, see, he was just copying. So, which was it? Was he a devoted disciple or a duplicator? To answer that, we have to understand a really important literary tradition called tazmin. For centuries in Persian and Urdu poetry, it was totally normal. In fact, it was a sign of skill to take a line or a couplet from a famous master and weave it into your own poem. This wasn't theft. It was seen as a sign of respect, like you were putting your own work into a conversation with the greats who came before you. And Iqbal's relationship with Rumi was one of deep public homage. I mean, this was no secret. He openly called Rumi his spiritual guide, his murshid. He adopted Rumi's signature poetic style, the Masnavi, for his own biggest works. He used tazmin with Rumi's verses, and at the most basic level, they were both drinking from the same well of inspiration, the Quran and the Sufi tradition. The similarity isn't theft, it's a shared spiritual and literary lineage. Okay, so we've looked at the specific case files. Now it's time to zoom out and look at the big picture. Let's look at the numbers. We did a quantitative analysis of every major allegation made against Iqbal's entire body of work, and here's what that data actually shows. So when we looked at 14 different categories of allegations, a really clear pattern emerged. Almost 86% of the claims are just invalid. They fall apart under scrutiny, just like the duo poem, where the attribution was there the whole time. Only about 7% are what you could call partially valid, meaning the attribution was inconsistent. And another 7% are questionable cases, like that unmarked poem from Cowper. But this number right here is maybe the most powerful piece of evidence. When you scan all of Iqbal's poetry, that's roughly 15,000 verses, the total number of documented, unattributed, borrowed lines is just incredibly small. We're talking about a few dozen lines at most. That adds up to less than 0.5% of his entire poetic output. All right, it's time to pull it all together for the final assessment. After looking at the individual cases and the hard data, we can deliver a verdict, making sure to keep in mind both the standards of his time and our own. So this table gives us a much more nuanced picture. Translating poems, synthesizing philosophy, these were totally standard practices in the 1920s, and they're still not considered plagiarism today, as long as you're not just copying word for word. The only real gray area by today's standards is that practice of tazmin. Back then, it is a traditional homage. Today, an academic paper would definitely require a much clearer citation. So what's the bottom line? The evidence simply does not support the charge of systematic plagiarism. The vast majority of the time he borrowed, he acknowledged it. The stuff that's unattributed is statistically tiny. And, maybe most importantly, in over 90 years of intense, serious academic study by scholars all over the world, not a single major, peer-reviewed study has ever accused him of plagiarism. These charges are a modern, social media-driven thing, not a scholarly one. And all of this leaves us with one final, really important question. Looking at Iqbal's case forces us to look at our own time. In an age of memes, music sampling, AI-generated art, and constant digital remixing, where do we, today, draw the line between inspiration and imitation? It's a question that his story makes more relevant now than ever.